What's going on, guys? Scar coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video. Today's video we diving into some meta decks that have come across, kind of populated up. These decks seem to be the more popular decks that are currently being played in the meta as a whole. These decks aren't exclusive just to best of one. This is just to Magic as a whole to kind of give you a better idea of kind of where Magic is competitively and things like that. With that being said, guys, if you liked the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But let's dive into each deck and let's talk about it. So first and foremost, the deck that actually is still fairly popular with the additional cards from Kaldheim is still mono Red Aggro. I mean, for the most part, the deck hasn't truly changed too much from its initial build. Sure, we have a couple new cards in the deck that kind of replace some of the older cards, but just kind of got a little bit better because we have snow-covered permanents as our lands. So we kind of exchange out a few other cards for things like Frostbite, Goldspan Dragon, and Faceless Haven, to name a few. I mean, the best thing, I guess, that came out of this is just the additional snow lands that help make the deck kind of maybe perform a little bit more smoothly. I think the additional having a land that comes into the battlefield that's a 4/3 with Vigilance, I think, also helps. Goldspan Dragon, if you haven't played against the card or played with the card is actually fairly strong, especially if your opponent can't really deal with it. You start producing tons of mana. And this is the build that actually performed the best over the weekend that I did see. It had the highest, placement in, I think, a Star City Games tournament that happened, I think, today as I'm recording. So this was, I feel like it was in the top 4, if not, one of the top decks. But I think if you just look at it overall, I think the shell of mono red has been so refined pretty so well over the past year and a half or so that it's been one of the more prominent decks in the meta as a whole. And this isn't the most played deck, surprisingly. This is actually one of the least played decks. I think it came in about 6% of the field was probably came in with this deck for the tournament. So it kind of shows you where mono red currently is in the best of 3 Magic. But I'm sure if you played a version of this, maybe combining a few cards from the sideboard, I feel like the deck is still fairly strong, except maybe against that mono white life gain matchup. But overall, I think the cards still do what they need to do, and they, with these slight improvements, I think the deck is just as good, if not better. With that being said, this is the deck that kind of was slightly right near the same area as mono red in play of how many decks were in the field as a whole, and that is Rakdos Midrange. I kind of did a version of this deck actually prior on the channel. With this deck, I didn't know it was going to be a deck that was going to be so prominent, but it was something I saw early in the meta kind of pop up as being an interesting deck, and this deck is actually very interesting on what it's trying to do. I mean, I think the idea here is Rakdos kind of lost a step too once rotation happened, because it lost a lot of things that produced, abilities to make your opponent sacrifice things. But I think this, this combination of cards that we have in this deck actually fares fairly well into the current meta as a whole. I think the idea of having a lot of removal in the early game to slow down your more aggro and aggressive decks, and having an interest in late game, like with something like Valky, for example, it's a very good, interesting card to look at what your opponent's doing early. At the same time, too, if you draw more later, you can actually play it as the Tibble on the other side. Which I think is one of those game changers, is on the ability here that once you can start exiling cards from top of each player's library, you always have the emblem when you do this, and then you can exile target creature or artifact and then be able to play it on your own side. And then if you get to the -8, you actually just exile all cards from graveyards and add 3 red mana to essentially play any cards that have been put in the graveyard this game if they have been exiled already. I think that combined with things like Crox is still like a beast. Now that he's the only really Elder Giant, I think Crox is, the more prominent. He's pretty effective, especially in that late game set. The deck has a lot of ways to fill up the graveyard with Timrets, Mire Tritons, ways to just kind of fill that graveyard up so that you can kind of, start getting more cards in your graveyard, so you can bring a Crox back early, possibly even on curve on turn 4. Egon is another card that's very, very interesting here. It's a 6/6 for the one side for 3 mana, Death Toucher. Though the downfall is you have to, on the beginning of your upkeep, you do have to exile 2 cards from your graveyard. If you can't, you have to sacrifice Egon and then draw a card, which is an okay thing. But having a 6/6 Death Toucher definitely on turn 3 definitely puts a little slowdown on what your opponent's trying to do. But I think the Throne of Death is actually another card that's actually fairly strong in this deck. Just the ability for 1 mana to be able to put on the battlefield, maybe to be able to mill yourself. Sure, it gets a little wonky if you're looking for a particular card, you start milling those cards into your graveyard, but then in the later game you can start exiling creatures from your graveyard and you can draw cards. So essentially it gives you a draw mechanic without having to play something like castle, the castle that will deal damage to you, especially in the later game if your health is low. And having things, some to combat some of the more decks that are prominent in the meta, something like Ox of Aganis is good here in the fact that it's good against other mill decks. Also, if you're milling yourself enough, you can play this from your graveyard, you know, draw a fresh new 3, which is also very good. I think overall, Rakdos has kind of got that little bit of a boost just on the way the meta shifted as a whole. I think, like I said, Valky definitely helps, and so does Egon. This is definitely one of those decks I could see kind of, you know, rise up in like prominence depending on how the meta shifts overall, but I do enjoy this deck and what it's trying to offer and what it's trying to do. Now, this deck here is a deck that you've probably seen all over the meta as a whole. This has been the new popular like, control style deck that I think a lot of people are playing, and that is Izzet Tempo. Essentially here we're playing a bunch of snow covered, you know, permanents as in our lands. We have a bunch of new cards from, you know, Kaldheim that kind of fit into the deck and what the deck offers. As you can see here, Goldspan Dragon's the one card that kind of sticks out. Like I said, he's a very strong tempo card. Very difficult for your opponent to remove that, you gaining like additional mana in that sense. You know, there's some very interesting interactions here. If your opponent does try to remove it and you may have a counter open, that it creates a weird, interesting you know, effect in that sense that I can kind of explain as I kind of go over other cards. We have Behold the Multiverse, which is another strong card in the deck, just because we can foretell it, and then on turn 4, turn 5, when we're starting to run a little low, we can scry 2 and then draw 2 effective cards that we really need. We have Solid Common, which is a very strong counter in the sense that we can foretell it and set it up for that counter spell that we're looking for. Like I said, you can actually, you know, combine this with something like Goldspan Dragon. So if your opponent does decide to target your Goldspan Dragon with a spell, you let that spell resolve, which then creates your treasure token, which then produces 2 additional mana, which then you can then cast your Solid Common to kind of combat your opponent from trying to remove it. And this is actually kind of interesting in, you know, kind of like one of these little things that you can kind of produce like protection for your dragon in a sense by its ability, which I think can get annoying, especially if you're the person playing against the Goldspan Dragon. But if you're the person playing Goldspan Dragon, this is something that's definitely very interesting. I kind of did a video where I did like a Jeskai deck where I made it like an aggro deck with runes and stuff, and it's one of those things that you can even target yourself and get yourself additional mana, which produces 2 mana, which is definitely great, especially if you can keep that momentum going or the tempo going. With that being said as well, we do have Frostbite, which is a very effective removal spell for 1 mana, dealing 3 damage if you have 3 or more snow permanents, which majority of our lands are snow permanents. So that is good there. It's a lot of good spot removal for the early game to slow down your opponent and their planeswalkers. Disdainful Stroke's actually interesting here because, you know, if you're playing a deck that's more control heavy or playing big spells, Disdainful Stroke could definitely counter those spells outright because it counters spells for a greater. We do have some creature hate. We do have, you know, negates for some spells that we want to get rid of. Scatter Skull Smashing for cards that we just want to get off the battlefield creature-wise. If we get it over 6 or more, we can do double the damage to those creatures. And of course, you get Brazen Borrower, Bone Crusher Giant. Those are cards that are definitely very solid in this style deck because they help keep you tempo. And then the mana base overall, we have the Faceless Haven, which helps us out in the sense that it becomes a creature. I know I'm blocking it, but for 3 snow mana, it becomes a 4/3 with Vigilance until end of turn. There's going to be a trend here. I feel like you're going to see a lot of decks that probably play Faceless Haven if they're playing snow lands, just on the basis that in the later game, if they don't have a lot of creatures, Faceless Haven does become a good creature to put pressure on your opponent, especially if you're not drawing into them, but you're drawing effective spells to combat your opponent's things. And of course, in a tempo deck, it wouldn't be a tempo deck without Shark Typhoon in one way or the other, whether we're going to play it out for its full 6 mana cost, or we can use it for cycling and dig a little bit deeper into our deck to draw a card and create an XX Shark token, depending on what we pay for X. But overall, this deck is straightforward. If you haven't played against it, this is definitely a deck that if you're in the meta, you know, ranking up in play queue or whatever, you will definitely come across this deck at some point and probably be like, wow, that's pretty solid deck regardless. And I think this is kind of like the way Izzet shifted from being like the other wave with Izzet spells, where you had like things that took advantage of you playing multiple non-creature spells. This is kind of where Izzet is currently, I think, in like more of a competitive way. Well, the next deck up on the list is Dimir Rogues, and I don't think I need to really talk about this one any more than you probably already know of. This is actually one of the reasons why I stopped really playing a lot of Magic, just because I don't really like the mill style combat, just because this deck does a lot of things that just get very frustrating very early, especially in a way that it's very effective what it's trying to do, because it doesn't play super expensive things. I mean, overall, the idea here is you play a lot of rogues that help mill your opponent's cards into their graveyard. Just to give you a rough rundown if you don't know what this deck does. And essentially, we're just trying to slowly mill out our opponent, if not be aggressive and hit with our creatures, and our creatures get advantage of, you know, if our opponent has, you know, X amount of cards, 8 or more cards in their graveyard or more. For example, like Thieves Guild Enforcer gets +2/+1 in Death Touch. Sorin Thought Thief gives all our rogues +1/+0. We can sacrifice Merfolk Wind Robber, you know, as long as they have 8 or more cards to draw a card. I think this deck's supposed to have Luris in it. I don't know why it didn't import properly from where I pulled it from the tournament. But it's supposed to have lure, so you can kind of like filter your rogues in and out. We also play Academia's Awakening to also get rogues back from our graveyard. If our opponent can't get rid of our graveyard, we can get them back if we do lose them. Low Mage Domination, which takes advantage of our opponent having more than 8 cards in their graveyard because it costs 3 less. So we can essentially, for 3 mana, if our opponent has, you know, a creature that that's converted mana cost 3 or less, we can just take control of it with this spell because it's going to cost 3 blue. Into the Story, we just draw a ton of cards that, you know, we refill our hand back up. We also play Didn't Say Please of 1 mine, which is just like Into the Story, but you know, we cost 2 less if we control a human. So for 1 mana, we can draw 2 cards, which is definitely effective. The mana base is pretty solid, you know, overall. Pathways, temples, Triome is interesting here, but I think this is the Triome's in there for maybe the possible card draw. Also, I don't think there's anything in the sideboard that really requires you know, green mana, but it's there for the card draw in the late game. But in the early game, it helps us filter some of our mana. Fable Passage, you know, helps us get our mana that we need. But overall, I mean, the deck hasn't really changed too much. It didn't really get any new cards from Kaldheim overall to change the deck. I think Rogues is one of those decks that really just take use of the Rogues that have previously come out. None of the Rogues that came out in Kaldheim are really effective for what this deck's trying to do. With that being said, let's move on to the next deck and let's talk about it. So this next deck here is a deck that is interesting in a way that a lot of the Yorian decks, I feel like, shifted from Doom Foretold Yorian or Esper Doom Foretold to more of a Sultai control style Yorian deck. Yet again, I don't know why the Yorian didn't copy over. I'll fix that so that if you import the deck into MTG Arena, you can have Yorian there. But this is the new kind of like popular Yorian deck that's currently out there. Essentially what it's trying to do is trying to, you know, control the early game and also ramp up in the beginning of the game to kind of get into our later game, like playing our ultimatums, you know, Seagate Restitution, Your Best Sea God, you know, Alrun's Empany, you know, we got Vorinclex, which is also very interesting here. This shuts down a lot of your opponent's things that would give them counters on sagas or any +1/+1 counters by essentially running them down, which is definitely very interesting. And then Shark Typhoon. And the idea here, like I said, is really just control the early game. You know, we have Valky here as well in the early game that we can take something from their hand, make Valky become that creature, or in the later game, play it as Tibble and then take advantage of it that way. But we're just drawing a lot of things that take advantage of when we play the Yorian. We can re-trigger things. You know, we have Omen of the Seas, we have, you know, Maze Mind Tome, Wolfwillow Haven, you got Binding of the Old Gods, which is a very good, solid, uncommon, you know, saga that just came out of Kaldheim, because of its first, second, and third ability. I mean, sure, the death touch doesn't really matter in this deck because we're more control, we don't play a lot of creatures, but the idea of, you know, allowing us to destroy target permanent opponent controls, then also ramp up a forest card, which essentially we can grab Triumph cards because they say forest on them, which is definitely very interesting. That helps us kind of, you know, filter our mana to get it the way we want to, and then get to something like Emergent Ultimatum to then possibly search our library for one of these cards here, and then kind of make our opponent make the choice of which one they want us to play, and which two they want us to play and which one they want us to go back. I think this card is also very interesting here because allowing us to take an extra turn is also very good for, you know, 2 mana initially and then paying it for 6 later instead of 7 mana outright is definitely fairly good. Sure, the 1/1 birds are okay. I mean, they're not going to win against an opponent with 1/1 birds, but the idea of taking extra turns with this style of deck is definitely very good. And combine a lot of these cards with Yorian just makes these cards just that much more effective. And I can kind of see why, you know, the Esper Doom Foretold decks kind of went away and went more towards this Sultai. Let's just overwhelm our opponent with a bunch of things that they have to make choices on and make the right choices if they are gonna, you know, try to stick this game out and hopefully, you know, turn the game around. But I do like this deck. I do think it's gonna be one of those decks you are gonna see a lot of, you know, those Yorian decks kind of turn into from, you know, the typical Doom Foretold Esper ones. But with that being said, let's move on to the next deck and let's talk about it. Now, this next deck here is a deck that you also probably seen a bunch of prior to Kaldheim releasing, but that deck is Gruul Aggro. Essentially, the only card that really has changed in this deck is just the addition of Goldspan Dragon because of its effectiveness and the ability to allow us to produce additional mana. I do like the interaction that I didn't mention in the other video or the other deck that had Goldspan Dragon because I don't think the deck was playing Embercleave. But the idea here is that you can actually swing it with a bunch of creatures, and when you actually tap Goldspan Dragon to actually attack in, you'll produce the mana, so then you can use this mana to then play your Embercleave on that turn. So if you're swinging very big with a lot of creatures, you can then essentially throw an Embercleave out on a creature that you want to as you're swinging in on that initial attack phase. Yet again, the deck takes advantage of, you know, using Edge Wall Innkeeper to then get card advantage from our adventure cards, though we only play like 8 of. But the idea here is if we do play them, we then get the additional card draw, which is definitely a good advantage. Brushfire Elemental, you know, it's a solid card that, you know, is just like it's just like you know, Quest and Beast on the idea that, you know, it can't be blocked by creatures 2 or less. Combine that with Landfall, we do play some Fabled Passages in the deck to kind of help pump that up. Same thing with Khazad-dû Mammoth, it gets pumped up with you know, Landfall, but whenever we play a land. This version doesn't actually play the Great Henge, which is actually fairly interesting. But I think the idea here is we're kind of just trying to overwhelm our opponent in the early game. You know, hopefully by turn 5, turn 6, when we actually are dropping Goldspan Dragon, they're at a point that they're at our mercy, and we're just gonna swing in for the win. I do think this version actually, right the way it is, could probably just work pretty well in the current meta as a whole, because I think this deck is just effective at what it's trying to do. The cards are on a very strong curve. You know, we have, you know, the 1 drops, we have 2 drops, we have 3 drops, 4 drops, and so on. The mana base is pretty solid. Maybe wonder yourself, why is the Riverglide pathway in here? Typically we're going to play this on red, but if you do want to add in, you know, Disdainful Stroke or Negate to kind of throw off your opponent in a Gruul deck, you can always go ahead if you feel like that's something you want to do. But in best of 1, you probably don't have to. So you could probably either take these out if you don't have them and add, like, you know, additional forests and mountains, or you can keep them in and just, you know, have just it automatically always be red mana. I mean, that's up to you at the end of the day. But I mean, overall, like I said, Gruul is pretty straightforward in what it's trying to do. And this was the most played deck this past weekend. I saw, you know, it was there a lot. It does what it does very well and very consistently. Now, this last deck here, I know I'm going over a lot of decks in this video. I do apologize if it's a lot of information to take in. I will have all the deck lists down below if you want to like take a look at them yourself and kind of like see each one and kind of maybe possibly build it if you find one interesting. But this next deck here is actually the deck that actually won the tournament overall, and I don't think it had the most you know, people playing it. And I think that's the reason why is because it's definitely a different deck, kind of even compared to the mono white late game deck. Sure, it's mono white, but this is more on the mono white aggro side. And what it's trying to do is be more aggressive and just trying to hit our opponent as hard as possible, as quick as possible in a mono white way. It did definitely get a couple cards from Kaldheim that definitely help it out in a way. You can see here we're playing snow covered, you know, plains and Faceless Haven. Of course, it's like I said, this is going to be the card you may see in a lot of aggro decks, because if you start not drawing creatures and stuff, this still becomes a 4/3 creature the opponent has to deal with at some point with vigilance. So definitely very good there. But the idea here is this deck is, yet again, we're just trying to hit our opponent in the face as hard as possible. Usher the Fallen is another strong card I do think a lot of people underestimate. Sure, it's only a 2/1, it could definitely be shocked, but getting this out on turn 1 and then possibly getting a Aspirant on turn 2 to give this +1/+1 to make it a 3/2. Definitely, you know, this starts to become a problem, and then in the later game you can start boasting it to then create additional 1 white creature tokens, which is also very effective in that way. The deck is also playing Sentinel's Eyes, which then gives our creatures vigilance and also +1/+1, which is also very interesting here, compared to where I've seen a lot of other decks do. I think the idea of giving our creature vigilance and now it doesn't tap down when we attack in with it is definitely also good, because then we can keep our stronger creature back as blockers. We got Giant Killers here to tap down our creatures, or also destroy larger creatures of 4 or greater. Selfless Savior to give our creature indestructible, which is very effective. It actually is not playing all Seeds of Life Bounty, because I guess it wants to, you know, effectively use a lot of our mana, and just this being a sacrifice ability is pretty strong. Though it does, you know, make our cards get harder to be, you know, protect if they get targeted by a particular spell. We're throwing Kabira's Takedown as a card here to, you know, deal damage to our opponent's creature or planeswalker they control based on the number of creatures we control. Because this deck is fairly on the cheaper end where we can play a lot of creatures very quickly, this card can become very effective in getting rid of some larger creature or larger planeswalker that we just can't really damage quickly enough to, you know, take it down. Of course, it's got Luminarch's Aspirant. I feel like if you're playing mono white, you're not playing this. I feel like this is the card that you should put in your deck, and then your deck will just become that much better, just because the ability of getting a +1/+1 counters every turn on one target creature is definitely fairly strong. Season Hollowblade, because the indestructible is very good, especially in the early game. This thing definitely, you know, can definitely block into some larger creatures, as well as, you know, eat little chump blockers as well, and you can sacrifice a card from your hand and make it indestructible. Maul the Skyclave, because, you know, why not give our creature +2/+2 and fly in for a strike? Definitely a very strong card in itself, and, you know, with it coming into ability into play for 3 mana and then automatically attaching to a creature, definitely fairly effective, definitely very good on curve. They run something like a Season Hollowblade or even an Usher of the Fallen. definitely a card that makes it hard for our opponent to deal with, you know, effectively. This one's actually very interesting here, and I actually haven't seen a lot of mono white decks play this, but this is actually Rendane, the God of the Worthy. A lot of decks are actually playing a lot of snow lands and snow permanents, so this one's interesting because this will make our opponent's snow lands that enter the battlefield come into play tapped, even basics, which is definitely very interesting. So it definitely penalizes those players, which I think was why this deck was so effective this weekend, because I think a lot of the decks that were playing snow permanents, which, you know, slowing down your opponent's land base makes a deck like this perform that much better. And then the other thing here is non-creature spells your opponent's cast with a converted may cost 4 greater, cost 2 more to cast. So essentially the front side of this card has attacks on your opponent if they're playing snow or playing spells larger than 4 by making them cost 2 more, which definitely makes a deck like this very good, because if you get this out on like turn 3 on curve and your opponent was going to do something like Shatter the Sky or Extinction Event or any sort of board removal, and now those spells cost 2 more and they can't play them until turn 6, which is definitely very effective. Sure, you can get Doomscarred. I don't know if it makes the Foretell side of Doomscar. I know the front, like the flat out cost side is going to cost 7, but I don't really know. I haven't actually had that interaction yet, but I think that's fairly interesting. I think the idea here of being a 2/3 flyer Vigilance is also very good with something like a Maul of the Skyclaves. So definitely a very good card that I think is going to be very situational, but I think by itself, making that other ability if you get stuck against control is definitely very effective. Of course, we're playing Skyclave of Apparition. It gets rid of something in our way or just something annoying that we just want off the battlefield. Like maybe if we're playing a mirror matchup, gets rid of our opponent's Maul of the Skyclaves. Definitely fairly good. We got 2 copies of Halvar for either possibly playing the sword if we really want that, or if we want to play Halvar himself outright. It gives target creature we control, you know, that's equipped or enchanted and have double strike. So combine that with something like Sentinel's Eyes for 1 mana, gives our creature now double strike with Vigilance, which is also very effective. And at the beginning of pre-combat, we may attach an aura or equipment card to a creature we control to target creature. Another creature we control, so we can swap things around depending on how we want to be effective. And that's also every combat, it's not just our combat, which is also very good. So if we swing in with certain creatures and leave some back on defense, we can move equipment around, move one equipment around or around to kind of prepare like a little bit of a wall, so our opponent is like gonna have to make a decision if we want to attack into that or not. Definitely a very interesting card. I feel like as if this deck becomes popular or more popular, you'll see a lot more of it. And then, of course, we got Legion Angel, just because the idea here is we play 1, we get more Legion Angels from our sideboard, and essentially just keep on refilling our hand, and we always have a threat to play every single turn, even if we draw into other things other than, you know, Legion Angels. And like I said, the mana base is pretty straightforward. 20 snow-covered plains, Faceless Havens. Pretty much that's the deck. And this is the deck, like I said, it won the weekend tournament for the Star City Games tournament, and I actually really like this deck list. It actually, from my like playtest, this deck is actually fairly strong, and I feel like I'm probably gonna make a video, especially on this one first, just because this one's actually the most different out of all the other decks from the list that I kind of went through. With that being said, guys, I'm gonna have all the links for these decks down below. If you want to take a look at each deck and maybe import them into MTG Arena. If you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button, and I'll catch you in the next video.